Alrighty, guys, we're going to get into our second bit of the American Revolution today. Just moving right into it, we're going to start by talking about the Saratoga campaign. So, basically, with this, the British had a strategy that they wanted to try to defeat the Americans by cutting the colonies in two. They figured the best way to do this would be to separate New England from the lower colonies. And they tried to do this by going through what's now northern New York and linking up on the Hudson, because the British Navy, which we remember was very powerful, was able to sail up the Hudson in good ways and prevent the colonists from moving on that side. And if they cut the land route above a certain point, they were potentially going to be able to cut the colonies in half. So an early stage of this is, if you remember back to last time we had a video, Fort Ticonderoga. That's where the Americans got the guns to shell Boston with. Well, the Patriots had control of that for a while, but at the start of the Saratoga campaign, the British retook it. From there, General Burgoyne, so that's the British general in charge of this operation, he tries to cut off Patriot supplies in Bennington, Vermont. On his way there, there's a small-ish battle, and you have the Patriots win that one, and they take about 700 Hessians as prisoners. Hessians were German mercenaries who were fighting for the British, and this was just done by the British to lower the amount of British soldiers they were risking when they were fighting against the Americans. So, as we were saying, part of Burgoyne's plan, so the British plan, was to cut the colonies in half, and one of the key cities in the area was Albany, our state capital. So, he tried to take it, and on the way there, the British are getting involved in the Battle of Saratoga, which is what the campaign's named after. It goes on for a day or two, but the Patriots end up winning, and this is a major Patriot victory. At the end of it, about 6,500 British and Germans surrender, and remember how we were talking last time how Bunker Hill was important because it showed the Patriots could fight a stand-up battle? This was the first time that the Patriots soundly defeated the British in a proper battle. And this strengthened the morale, and another key thing it did was change the perception of the Patriots across the world. Before Saratoga, the French, they wanted to support the Americans, not because they believed in our liberty and independence, but they wanted to hurt Britain. Think back to the French and Indian War. They just fought this bloody and costly war against the British, so anything they could do to help hurt the British, they'd do. So before the Battle of Saratoga, they would send American arms and ammunition, but it had to be very quietly because they were not officially at war with the British. But after Saratoga, they felt confident that the Americans could win this war, so they openly declared war and openly supported us. But this was not just because of the victory at Saratoga. Benjamin Franklin, if we remember back to last unit, he was a key diplomat, and what he was doing was basically convincing the French both that we could win and then in some circles of the worthiness of our cause. Because if you guys will remember, in a couple of years after this, France will go into their own revolution, and the seeds of that are being sown already. One of the biggest things that came of France joining the war was the French Navy joined. While having more troops in the continent was important, having something to balance out the British Navy was perhaps the single largest result of the France joining the war. This meant that the British didn't have complete control of the seas, and because what we would see before this is sometimes the Americans would win a battle or two and push the British into the sea, but then you'd have the Navy sail right up and basically just bail them out. With the French Navy now in play, the British Navy is still more powerful, but it just does not guarantee that the British have that option. Valley Forge. So 1777, the Patriot capital was in Philadelphia. About the same time as the Battle of Saratoga, the British launched an operation and captured Philadelphia. Congress flees, and Washington is in the area, launches a couple battles. It doesn't go particularly well, but they're able to survive, and winter comes. During this time, you can't fight a war during the winter. It's just not logistically impossible. So Washington makes his winter camp in Valley Forge. Valley Forge is about 25 miles northwest of Philadelphia. This is close enough that he can stay, keep an eye on the British, but still far enough away that if the British decided they were going to launch a surprise attack, try to crush them, they'd have time to react. But this winter is particularly cold and harsh, and there was a severe lack of winter clothing and boots. You hear stories of Continental soldiers walking around barefooted, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. It was really a brutal time. Food supplies were low. During this, though, you had a German volunteer. He was an officer in the German army, and the German army at this time, they were small, but they were very well disciplined. And he came over and volunteered to have some of his skill to train up the Continental Army. And he did that, and despite all the hardship, because of his training, the Continental Army, when the spring of 1778 came around, they were actually stronger than they were when they went into Valley Forge. But during that winter, you have to remember this is a time before modern medicine, and there was very serious lack of food and lack of clothing. Over 2,000 American soldiers died there. For perspective, that's more Americans dying in Valley Forge than died in any single battle in the entire Revolution. That's how challenging this was. And for George Washington, this will kind of be a theme for him for the entire war. His greatest achievement at Valley Forge was keeping the army together. This is a point where the entire revolution could have collapsed. The Americans there could have said, you know what? I'm freezing. I'm hungry. I'm going home. I don't want to fight this much. I'd rather live, and whatever, we'll live with the British. But Washington was able to create a necessity that the army stayed together and they were able to fight on. So in 1781, the war finally comes to a close. The Americans and French together pushed the British into basically a series of forts in the Chesapeake Bay area around the town of Yorktown. They trapped the British there. The British are surrounded by the American and French on three sides, and their backs are to the water. So the the Americans and French lay siege to them, and the British were actually okay with this at first because, as what's happened previously here, the British army gets trapped, the Navy would just come in, pick them up, and bail them out. But this time, it couldn't happen because if we remember back to with France entering the war, their Navy came into play. And this led to a major naval battle outside of the Chesapeake Bay. France wins that, and then this leads to the British garrison in Yorktown surrendering, because with the British Navy defeated there was no rescue for them. So they surrender there, and this is the last major battle of the war. It was about 8,500 British troops that surrender. That number actually outnumbers the amount of Americans and French that were besieging them. But a major result of this surrender is it puts immense pressure on Parliament to end the war. Just to illustrate how unexpected and revolutionary this surrender of what was the most powerful military in the world to what was essentially a ragtag bunch of rebels. Yes, they were supported by France, but the Americans were the majority of the fighting in the war was done by the Americans. But to illustrate how revolutionary it was, when the British went to surrender, their troops were laying down their guns and stuff. Band was there, and they were playing a song that was pretty famous at the time. It was called When the World Was Turned Upside Down. And that's just the mindset of how could this happen? It was an unthinkable defeat for the British Empire at this time. All right, so Treaty of Paris. So, following the defeat at Yorktown, as I was saying, the British Parliament's willing to make peace, finally. It's been an expensive war. They've lost way more than they should have, and they're figuring, because if you remember, the whole reason why Britain has colonies is they want to make money. So they're figuring it's just going to be better to let these guys go. It's not worth the trouble. And the treaty, it was actually very favorable to the Americans. It granted lands all the way west to the Mississippi River and everything south of the Great Lakes, roughly. So that's this is going to be Ohio, Kentucky area, some of Michigan. That was all given to the new American Republic. One key point of this was the French weren't involved in the negotiations. This is important for a couple of reasons. Well, first off, the French and British were still at war. It was a separate peace with the Americans. The French and Spanish and Dutch, who all supported the Americans, would continue to fight the British for another couple months to years around the world. If I remember correctly, at this time, the French were also fighting the British in India and on the seas. So the American Revolution was a global war. That's part of the reason why the French were not involved in this group of treaties. But another important result of it was the British treating the Americans like we are a legitimate country. It's not okay, we'll end the war now, but the French are the real players at the table. So it wasn't like the British were transferring ownership of the American colonies to the French. It was the Americans, the colonies, you are a legitimate country. We'll let you do your own thing. One thing about the treaty that was not favorable to loyalists who had fled the country is they weren't allowed to return back to the colonies. If you supported the crown and you had either fled to Britain or fled to Canada, the treaty did not let you go back to your home. Another result of the treaty was that the protections granted to Native Americans by Proclamation of 1763, remember that was saying that the colonists couldn't go past the Appalachian Mountains, and as well as all the other British treaties that they had made, it didn't apply to the United States. This goes back to Britain seeing us as our own legitimate nation and as a new nation in that effect.